Now that we're really grounded in the 1948-49 war and the immediate aftermath of that war, the next major event that we're going to dive into is the Six-Day War in 1967. Now, there is a period of time between 1949 and 1967, where there are some important historical events. And what I want to do in this chapter is just share some of those basics with you so that you don't lose the larger connectivity of Israeli history. So let's dive in. There are three main subjects that are worth touching on in this chapter. The first is the establishment and revision of the law of return. The second is the Sinai campaign in 1956. And the third is the Decade of Calm that was marked by a watershed deal between Israel and West Germany for reparations for the Holocaust and the intentionally public trial of the Nazi criminal Adolf Eichmann. In 1950, Israel established the law of return that allowed any Jew to immediately immigrate to Israel and be eligible for citizenship. This was part of Israel's promise to the Jews around the world that finally there would be a Jewish home and a safe haven. This was especially poignant in 1950, just a few years after the Holocaust. Originally, a definition wasn't provided for what made someone Jewish. The law simply stated that, quote, every Jew has the right to immigrate to the state of Israel, end quote. In 1970, the law of return was revised, making two major changes. First, it defined a Jew as someone born to a Jewish mother based on the traditional Jewish legal definition. And second, in a moment of strange irony, the revised law expanded the scope of who was covered by the law of return based on the Nazi definition of who was a Jew, namely anyone with one Jewish grandparent. The second major event during this period of time was the Sinai campaign in July of 1956. With some encouragement from the Soviet Union, Egypt seized and nationalized the Suez Canal, an essential waterway for international trade that connects the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. This was seen as a major act of aggression and a threat to the economic interest of Western powers. So Britain and France planned alongside Israel to invade the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt in order to pressure the reopening of the canal. Israel, with its British and French allies, conquered the Sinai more quickly than they had ever expected. However, the Soviets began to pressure the British, French, and Israelis to halt their attack before fully conquering the Suez Canal. In exchange, Egypt agreed to allow Israeli shipping to pass through the canal and to leave the Sinai Peninsula demilitarized. Israel understood that if Egypt were to go back on either of these promises, as they ended up doing in 1967, it would amount to an act of war. Despite this military loss, the leader of Egypt proclaimed victory, and it is seen throughout the Arab world that he became a champion of anti-colonialism. The Israelis, on the other hand, once again demonstrated their military strength to the world. Following the Sinai campaign, we have the third major marker of this period, often called the Decade of Calm, that lasted from 1957 until 1967. During these years, Israel didn't have a major war and was able to focus on state building, economic development, and the full absorption of new Jewish immigrants and refugees from around the world. There were two significant developments that took place during this decade. First, David Ben-Gurion, as Prime Minister of Israel, negotiated a controversial deal with West Germany in 1951 and 52, whereby Israel received a whole host of economic perks, as well as formal reparations for the Holocaust. Some Israelis were angry that Ben-Gurion would even speak to the Germans so soon after the Holocaust. But most historians see this move by David Ben-Gurion as a brilliant strategic move that got the new state the essential money they needed to establish itself. The second major development was the capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann, a famous Nazi leader. When Eichmann was captured in Argentina in 1960, he was intentionally brought back to the state of Israel for a public and painful trial. Ben-Gurion believed that Israel and the Jewish people needed a public reckoning with the atrocities of the Holocaust, and he saw this trial as a way of forcing Israelis to come to terms with this history. The trial took place in Israel in 1961. Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against the Jewish people and was hanged in 1962. Now that we've covered these few details, we can dive into the next major tension point in Israel's history, which is the Six-Day War and the birth of the settlements. We'll get to this in the next chapter. It is going to be a juicy one, and there's a lot to cover. But by getting grounded in the history of the Six-Day War and the birth of the settlements, we're going to understand even present-day Israel in more clear-eyed and more complex terms. Looking forward to seeing you then.